The last message Elias Vance received from Omniterra was not a farewell, but an invoice. It blinked on his terminal with cold, green finality, an automated summary of liquidated assets, 1 orbital habitat, 1 atmospheric lander, 3 geothermal power cores, and the line item that made his stomach clench: Biocontainment Suite 7, which was the official designation for the pressurized shell of recycled metal and synthetic fabrics he called home. He was an asset being liquidated, a rounding error in a quarterly report filed 3 galaxies away. The message concluded with a sterile sign-off. Thank you for your service to the Omniterra Collective. This channel is now terminated. Then, silence. Not the quiet between transmissions, but a profound and absolute deadness, the digital severing of a soul from its universe. He was alone on Xylos, a planet cataloged as commercially non-viable, a world of rust-colored flora and perpetual twilight, and his oxygen recycler was programmed to fail in 72 hours. Omniterra was efficient. If nothing else, they didn't just abandon their failed investments. They scheduled their obsolescence. For 3 years, Elias had sent back reports filled with wonder. He described the Mycelian Chorus, a planet-spanning fungal network that pulsed with a low, rhythmic bioluminescence, a soft green-gold light that ebbed and flowed with the planet's slow, magnetic tides. He detailed the Sylvans, slender, 6-limbed creatures with chitinous skin the color of petrified wood and wide, multifaceted eyes that saw in spectrums he could only guess at. They were not sentient, his initial reports concluded, a mistake born of human arrogance and a checklist that defined intelligence by its ability to build, conquer, or speak. The Sylvans didn't build. They cultivated. They moved through the towering, rust-leafed forests in silent, deliberate patterns, tending to the glowing fungal colonies, their long, delicate fingers stroking the luminous caps as if they were comforting a child. He'd watched them for months, convinced they were simply fauna in a complex symbiotic relationship with the flora, gardeners in a garden without a master. He'd filed his final assessment. Xylos was a biological marvel, a closed-loop ecosystem of breathtaking complexity, but it held no resources worth the cost of extraction, no rare minerals, no strategic value, no exploitable intelligence. Non-viable. He had signed his own death warrant with a word. The first day was a blur of panicked activity. He tried to override the recycler's shutdown sequence, his fingers flying across the terminal. But Omniterra's encryption was a fortress. He attempted to cannibalize the lander's short-range comms array, hoping to bounce a desperate signal off a passing survey drone, but the power conduits were already fused. Another scheduled failure. By the second day, desperation gave way to a cold, clear-eyed terror. The air in his habitat grew thin, carrying the metallic tang of his own recycled fear. He stared out of the reinforced plasteel viewport at the alien forest, at the silent, ceaseless work of the Sylvans, and felt a rage so pure it burned the back of his throat. He wasn't dying because of a catastrophic failure or a noble sacrifice. He was dying because a cost-benefit analysis on a distant spreadsheet had come up with the wrong number. He was a line item, deleted, on the third day, with the habitat's emergency lights casting long, dancing shadows and the air thick enough to taste. He made a choice. He could die in his sterile metal tomb, or he could die outside, breathing the air of the world that had fascinated him for years. The air of Xylos was rich in nitrogen and argon, with a cocktail of pollens and microbes that his suit's analyzer had flagged as mildly toxic over long-term exposure. Long-term exposure was a luxury he no longer had. He sealed his helmet, the hiss of the pressurized seal sounding like a final exhalation, and cycled the airlock. The outer door slid open, and he stepped onto the mossy alien soil for the last time. The air inside his helmet was already stale. The CO2 scrubbers were failing, and each breath felt shallower than the last. He walked away from the habitat, away from the monument to his failure, and headed into the heart of the forest, toward the largest concentration of the glowing mycelium he had mapped. If he was going to die, he wanted to see it one last time. He didn't get far. The world began to swim, the edges of his vision blurring into a dark, creeping vignette. His lungs burned, screaming for oxygen they couldn't have. He stumbled over a thick, coiled root, the impact jarring the last of the air from his chest. He fell, his helmet cracking against a stone with a sickening sound. He felt a rush of cold, alien air against his cheek, smelled the rich, loamy scent of the forest floor, a scent of decay and life all at once. This is it, he thought, a strange sense of calm washing over him. The darkness at the edge of his vision closed in, and the last thing he saw was a pair of large, black, multifaceted eyes staring down at him, reflecting the pale, pulsing light of the forest. He awoke not to light, but to a feeling. It was a sensation of being held, not by hands, but by something far larger, a gentle and pervasive pressure that seemed to soothe the frantic, ragged edges of his consciousness. There was no pain. The fire in his lungs was gone, replaced by a cool, clean stillness. He tried to open his eyes, but his lids felt heavy, sealed. He wasn't breathing, not in the traditional sense of muscle and air, yet he felt a flow of something vital moving through him, a current of life that was not his own. A thought, faint and fragmented, drifted through his mind. I'm dead. But another feeling rose to meet it, a feeling that was not a thought, but a certainty, ancient and deep. You are not. You are connected. He felt a presence nearby, the same presence he'd seen before he lost consciousness. He could sense its form without seeing its slender, patient, watchful. A Sylvan. He felt its curiosity, a gentle, probing question that had no words. It was not asking who he was, but what he was. This strange, soft, broken thing that had fallen in their forest. He tried to answer, to form a thought, but his mind felt like a shattered mirror. Instead, a flood of his own feelings poured out of him: fear, loneliness, betrayal, the cold, sharp sting of being abandoned. He felt the Sylvan recoil slightly, not in fear, but in a kind of sympathetic pain, as if it had touched a live wire of raw, human emotion. Then the larger presence, the one that held him, responded. It flowed over his fractured memories, not erasing them, but cushioning them in a vast, profound quiet. It felt like sinking into a deep, warm ocean. Images and feelings that were not his began to drift through his consciousness. He felt the slow, patient growth of roots through ancient soil, the turning of the planet over millennia, the silent communication of the forest, the joy of a sun that was not his own warming bark, that was not his skin. He felt the collective consciousness of the Sylvans, not as individuals, but as notes in a single, unending chord. They were the hands, and this vast, quiet thing was the mind. This was the mycelian chorus, and he was lying at its heart, plugged into the soul of the planet itself. Days, or perhaps weeks, passed in this state. He was fed, not with food, but with a nutrient-rich liquid that was seeped gently into his body through a network of impossibly fine filaments that had grown over his skin. They were healing him, knitting together his broken body with the same patience they used to cultivate the forest. The crack in his helmet had been sealed with a hard, translucent resin, and the toxic elements of the air were being filtered not by a machine, but by a living membrane that had formed over the opening. He learned their language, which wasn't a language at all. It was a sharing. They didn't speak of things. They shared the experience of them. When one sylvan felt the morning dew on a rust leaf, they all felt it. When one sensed a predator, they all knew caution. And when they had found him, broken and dying, they had all felt his pain. His human memories began to feel distant, like stories he'd read about someone else. The sterile corridors of the orbital station, the face of his supervisor on a flickering screen, the endless drone of machinery, it was all fading, replaced by the constant, gentle hum of the chorus. He remembered his name, Elias, but it felt like an old, ill-fitting coat. Here, he had no name. He was simply a part of the whole, a new and discordant note that was slowly, patiently being brought into harmony with the rest of the song. When he was finally strong enough, the filaments receded, and the Sylvans helped him sit up. He opened his eyes, and the world he saw was both familiar and brand new. The forest floor was a tapestry of glowing mosses and fungi, the light pulsing in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The towering trees seemed to breathe, their massive trunks expanding and contracting in a cycle too slow for a human eye to have noticed before. A Sylvan stood before him, head tilted in that familiar, curious gesture. It held out a fruit, a soft, purple bulb that pulsed with its own faint light. He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He felt the Sylvan's feeling of offering, of sustenance, of welcome. He no longer felt like an observer, a scientist studying a subject. He was a resident. But as his strength returned, so did the ghosts of his past. Lying in the quiet dark, surrounded by the chorus's silent empathy, he would sometimes see the cold, green text of that final message from Omniterra. He would feel the sting of their betrayal, the cold indifference of the corporation that had created and then discarded him. The chorus would sense his turmoil and flow around the sharp edges of his anger, soothing it, trying to understand it. But they couldn't fully grasp it. They were a unified whole. The concept of one part of the whole willfully harming another for something as abstract as profit was utterly alien to them. They understood pain, loss, and danger, but not malice, not the cold, calculated cruelty of a balance sheet. He tried to explain. He shared his memories of Earth, of cities that scraped the sky, of oceans of people who were all alone, of a species that had mastered the atom but had never learned to listen to its own world. He showed them the concept of a corporation, a faceless entity that existed only to grow, consuming worlds and people in its quest for more. He shared the memory of the invoice, the liquidation, the scheduled termination of his life support. As he did, he felt a new emotion ripple through the chorus, something he had never sensed from them before. It was a quiet, deep, and chilling feeling, a harmony shifting into a minor key. It was the birth of an idea that had never before existed in their world. It was the concept of a threat. He had not only been saved by them, he had become a warning. He was their first, intimate lesson in the nature of humanity. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that Omniterra, or someone like them, would one day come back. The universe was full of spreadsheets and xylos, which he had once declared non-viable, was now the most valuable thing in his existence, and he had just taught its heart how to fear. The change was not sudden, but it was absolute. Elias felt it as a subtle shift in the planet's slow, deep breathing, a new tension in the hum of the mycelial chorus. Before, the chorus had been a symphony of existence, a harmonious blend of growth, decay, and rebirth. Now, a new theme had been introduced, a discordant undercurrent of vigilance. He had given them the concept of a threat, and the planet, in its vast and silent wisdom, had begun to arm itself. The bioluminescence of the fungal network, once a soft and steady guide through the perpetual twilight, now flickered and pulsed with meaning. A sharp, rapid strobing near the perimeter of the great forest meant an unknown scent on the wind, a deep, slow wave of crimson light that washed through the mycelial pathways meant a memory of his pain had surfaced somewhere in the collective. The forest was no longer just living, it was thinking, and its thoughts were of survival. The Sylvans, once serene cultivators, now moved with a new economy of motion. Their silent processions through the trees were no longer just for tending the fungi, they were patrols. They would pause for long moments, their multifaceted eyes scanning the canopy, their delicate limbs testing the stability of ancient branches, their bodies no longer just inhabiting the world, but actively mapping it for its defensive potential. He watched as they began to cultivate new flora, plants he had never seen before. There was a vine that, when disturbed, would snap forward and release a cloud of fine, paralytic spores. There were thick-husked gourds that, under pressure from the growing resin within them, would harden until they were like stone. The garden was growing thorns. Elias walked through this changing world as both its savior and its disease. He was the echo, the name the chorus had gently placed upon his consciousness, for he was the reflection of a world they had never known. He was their only source of information on the coming storm, and the weight of that responsibility was a physical thing, a pressure behind his eyes that never faded. He led the Sylvans to the wreckage of his atmospheric lander, a skeletal ruin half swallowed by the rust-colored vegetation. He placed his hands on the cold, pitted metal and shared the memory of its purpose. He showed the chorus the controlled violence of its thrusters, the fury of chemical combustion harnessed to defy gravity. He shared the concept of a tool that was also a weapon, of technology born not from symbiosis, but from conquest. He felt the chorus recoil, a wave of collective nausea at the sheer, brutal inefficiency of it all, burning a world just to leave it. But beneath the recoil was a dawning, terrifying understanding. To fight the Firebringers, one had to understand fire. They began to experiment. Under his guidance, the Sylvans packed the hardened gourds with a volatile mix of pollens and resins. They learned to use the tension of bent branches to launch these crude projectiles, not with great accuracy, but with enough force to shatter stone. They were not building machines. They were teaching the forest to clench its fist. He taught them the art of deception, a concept as alien to their unified consciousness as hate. He showed them how to create dead zones, areas where the mycelium would deliberately dim its light, feigning lifelessness to lure a threat into an ambush. He taught them about choke points, about the strategic value of a narrow canyon or a dense thicket of spore vines. He was a general with an army that did not understand the concept of a command, only of shared intent. He did not give orders. He presented a problem to the chorus, and the planetary mind would devise a solution with a creativity that was both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. He was twisting this world, reshaping its serene innocence into a reflection of humanity's own paranoia. There were nights, lying cocooned in the warm, pulsing light of the chorus, when the guilt was a physical agony. He had escaped the sterile cage of Omniterra, only to rebuild its bars here, forged from leaves and fear. He had fled the machine only to become its architect in the heart of the garden. The chorus would sense his despair and surround it with a feeling of profound, unwavering acceptance. They did not judge him. He was a part of them now, and his pain was their pain, his fear their fear. His past was not a sin. It was a scar they all now shared. The first test came on the 312th cycle since his awakening. It was a flicker in the upper atmosphere, a glint of something hard and fast and utterly alien. Elias felt it through the chorus as a sharp, piercing sting, like a needle lancing into their collective awareness. It was a probe, an Omniterra scout drone, sleek and silver and utterly silent. It sliced through the clouds, its multifaceted optical sensors already mapping, analyzing, and cataloging everything below. It was looking for resources, for signs of his technology, for a reason to justify a second visit. It was the detached, analytical gaze of the spreadsheet, returned to audit its write-off. A wave of pure, cold panic washed through the chorus, the first true fear he had felt from them. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, primal terror he had not felt since the air had run out in his helmet. But then another feeling rose to meet it, flowing from him into the network resolve. He had been preparing them for this. He had been preparing himself. The panic subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp focus that was a perfect fusion of his own tactical mind and the planet's immense, distributed consciousness. He didn't need to give an order. The plan unfolded as a shared, instantaneous understanding. The probe descended, following the faint energy signature of his abandoned habitat. The chorus immediately dampened all bioluminescence in a 5-kilometer radius, plunging the forest into an unnatural, absolute darkness. The drone's sensors, suddenly deprived of ambient light, switched to active thermal and motion scanning. That was the first trap. The Sylvans had spent weeks creating thermal decoys, pouches of heat-storing moss that mimicked the signature of a living creature. The drone, following its programming, pursued the nearest heat sign, which led it away from the habitat and deeper into the forest, toward a narrow, winding canyon Elias had designated as a killing ground. As the drone zipped through the canyon, its scanners sweeping the walls, the next phase began. From hidden crevices, Sylvan secreted a fine, aerosolized resin. It wasn't a projectile, it was a mist that filled the air, clinging to the drone's external sensors, blurring its vision, and gumming up the delicate mechanisms of its atmospheric samplers. Confused, its programming struggling to reconcile the conflicting data, the drone slowed, hovering above, on the canyon rim. The true weapon waited for months. The Sylvans had been nurturing a colossal, ancient tree, feeding it a concentration of nutrients from the mycelial network, encouraging its growth along a fissure in the rock. It was a living siege engine, a pillar of wood and time held in place by a thread of roots. As the drone hovered below, blinded and confused, the chorus gave a single, unified command. The roots contracted. The massive tree, with a sound like the world tearing in half, did not fall. It was pulled, crashing down into the canyon with an apocalyptic force. The impact crushed the drone instantly, its advanced alloy shell crumpling like foil. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a question that had been answered. The Sylvans emerged from their hiding places, their multifaceted eyes gazing at the wreckage. A thing of straight lines and dead metal broken by the sheer, organic power of their world. Elias made his way to the crash site, his bare feet sinking into the damp soil. He felt a wave of triumph from the chorus, a pure and uncomplicated sense of a threat neutralized. But as he looked at the twisted metal, he felt a cold dread. He found the drone's central processing unit, cracked but intact. Nestled within it, still faintly glowing, was a quantum-entangled communicator. It was designed to send a final, compressed data burst upon its own destruction. He focused his mind, sharing his knowledge with the chorus, translating the last ghostly message that had screamed across the void. Xylos. Non-viable designation incorrect. Asset survivor presence unconfirmed. Indigenous life demonstrates coordinated, technologically aware defensive capabilities. Hostile intent confirmed. Recommend full spectrum reclamation protocol. Priority Alpha. The message was a death sentence. He had taught them how to fight. He had shown them they could win a battle. And in doing so, he had just started a war. The quiet vigilance that had settled over Xylos was gone, replaced by the certainty of a coming apocalypse. The song of the chorus had changed forever. It was no longer a hymn to life, but a drumbeat, waiting for the enemy to appear over the horizon. The drumbeat of war echoed not in sound, but in light and soil. In the cycles that followed the destruction of the probe, Xylos underwent a metamorphosis so profound it was as if the planet itself were girding for battle. The rust-leafed forests, once a uniform sea of muted crimson, began to differentiate. Vast swathes of canopy thickened, their leaves layering into a dense, interlocking armor that could deflect scans and absorb energy weapon impacts. Other areas were deliberately thinned, creating clear fields of fire for the resin-hardened projectiles they had learned to launch. The mycelian chorus. The planet's nervous system rerouted its primary pathways, sinking them deeper into the planet's crust, shielding them from orbital bombardment while extending a finer, more sensitive network of sensory filaments to the surface. The entire world was becoming a fortress, and Elias was its unwilling castellan. His role shifted from teacher to strategist. He spent his days and nights in communion with the chorus, not sleeping, but sinking into a state of shared consciousness where time flowed differently. He walked them through every Omniterra protocol he could remember, from standard planetary dropship formations to the brutal logic of their terraforming engines. He shared the cold, hard physics of plasma weaponry, the insidious nature of nanite swarms, the chilling efficiency of a corporate military that viewed sentient life as an obstacle to be removed from a resource claim. He poured all the ugliness of his former life into the pristine mind of the planet and felt the chorus absorb it, analyze it, and begin to formulate a defense that was terrifying in its organic elegance. The Sylvans were no longer just gardeners. They had become the living instruments of the planet's will. They moved in silent, coordinated cadres, their chitinous limbs a blur of motion as they wove defensive thickets from spore vines and dug deep, camouflaged pits lined with sharpened roots. He saw the birth of specialization, an idea that had never existed in their collective society. Some Sylvans, leaner and faster, became scouts, their multifaceted eyes now attuned to the slightest unnatural movement. Others, larger and more robust, became guardians, their bodies naturally reinforcing with hardened plates of resin and bark, their limbs thickening into living clubs. One group, the Weavers, developed the most astonishing ability of all. They learned to manipulate the mycelial filaments directly, coaxing them to grow into complex, lattice-like structures. They wove living nets that could ensnare a landing craft and bioluminescent traps that could mimic the energy signature of a power source, luring the enemy into kill zones. He watched them work, a silent, tireless army, and saw not the peaceful cultivators he had first encountered, but a reflection of the very thing he had warned them against: a society organizing itself for total war. The innocence he had cherished was the first casualty. The waiting was a unique form of torture. The silence from the void was no longer a sign of peace, but a heavy-motored, pregnant pause. Every shooting star, every atmospheric shimmer, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the planetary consciousness. Elias felt the collective anxiety as a low, persistent hum, a dissonant chord that never fully resolved. He walked the forest, no longer marveling at its beauty, but assessing its tactical weaknesses. That ridge could be used for observation by an enemy sniper. That river could be a pathway for an amphibious assault. His mind, trained by Omniterra's own academy, was now a weapon turned against them. But using it felt like a betrayal of the world that had saved him. He had become the echo in a way he had never intended. He was not just a reflection of humanity's knowledge, but a mirror of its deepest flaws, its paranoia, its obsession with conflict, its instinct to meet a threat with overwhelming force. He was teaching the garden how to become a battlefield, and he hated himself for how good he was at it. The sky broke not with a single ship, but with a dozen. They dropped out of warp space in a perfect brutalist formation, 3 hulking Reclaimer-class cruisers, flanked by 9 Viper-class assault landers. They were not the sleek exploration vessels of his past life. These were machines of conquest, slab-sided and bristling with weapon emplacements, their hulls painted a dull, non-reflective gray that seemed to absorb the very light of the system's star. They made no attempt at stealth. This was not an audit. It was an extermination. The moment they entered the atmosphere, a wave of pure, concentrated energy lanced down from the lead cruiser. It wasn't a weapon meant to kill. It was an electromagnetic pulse, a planet-scale haymaker designed to fry any technology it touched. The wreckage of Elias's habitat, his lander, and the scout drone were instantly rendered inert, their metallic shells glowing cherry red before fading to junk. The message was clear: your toys are broken. Now you deal with us. Elias felt the EMP wash over the planet through the chorus, but it had no effect. The planet's defense was not technological. It was biological. As the assault landers began their descent, streaking through the upper atmosphere like burning knives, the planet responded. The first wave of defense was atmospheric. 1 billion spores, cultivated for this very purpose, were released from the canopy, rising on thermal updrafts to form a dense, shimmering cloud. To the lander's sensors, it was just pollen, but as they flew through it, the spores clung to their viewports, worked their way into engine intakes, and coated their sensor arrays. The spores were corrosive, secreting an enzyme that began to eat away at plasteel and soften wiring insulation. The Viper pilots, flying blind and with their instruments flickering, were forced to rely on inertial guidance, their perfect formation beginning to waver. Then came the second wave. The forest itself reached for them. The weavers had spent months coaxing the branches of the colossal rust-leaf trees to grow upwards, creating a net of interlocking limbs hundreds of feet above the forest floor. As the blinded landers descended into this trap, massive, resin-coated vines, thick as a man's torso and guided by the chorus, whipped out from the canopy. They were not trying to crush the ships, but to snare them. One Viper, its engines already sputtering from the corrosive spores, was caught. 12 vines wrapped around its wings and fuselage, the sheer biological strength of the forest arresting its descent with a groan of tortured metal. The pilot fought for control, but the ship was hopelessly entangled. A fly in a planetary web. The Sylvan Guardians, waiting below, swarmed the captured vessel. They did not use weapons. They simply began to tear it apart, their hardened limbs prying open hatches and ripping through the hull with terrifying force. The screams of the Omni-Terra Marines inside were short-lived, silenced by the silent, efficient wrath of the forest. 2 other landers, seeing the fate of their comrade, tried to pull up, their thrusters burning hot. It was then that the forest unveiled its artillery, the hardened gourds, launched by the immense tension of bent trees, arced through the air. They were inaccurate, but they didn't need to be precise. They burst on impact, showering the lander's engines with a thick, flammable resin that ignited instantly in the heat of the thrusters. One lander's engine exploded, sending it into a flat spin before it crashed into a mountainside. The other, trailing fire, managed to limp away, trying to gain altitude. Elias watched the battle unfold, not with his eyes, but through the 1,000-eyed gaze of the chorus. He was everywhere at once in the canopy with the weavers, on the ground with the guardians, in the air with the corrosive spores. He felt the savage triumph of the first kill, the grim satisfaction of the second. He was a god of this small, violent world, directing a war from a throne of roots and mycelium, but there was no glory in it. He also felt the terror of the young Marine trapped in the snared Viper, the searing pain of the pilot in the burning lander. The chorus, in its empathy, could not filter these things out. They experienced the death of their enemies not as a victory, but as a shared agony, a wound to the universal fabric of life. Winning felt like dying. As the surviving landers regrouped, retreating to a higher altitude to reassess, Elias knew this was just the beginning. They had swatted the Wasps, but the nest was still in orbit. The Reclaimer-class cruisers, silent and patient, hung in the sky like judgment, their belly ports beginning to glow with the unmistakable light of a troop deployment. They were done with machines. Now they were sending the men. The response from the reclaimer cruisers was not a counterattack, it was an avalanche. From the glowing belly of each ship, not landers, but hundreds of individual drop pods were released. A shotgun blast of humanity aimed at the heart of the world. They blazed through the atmosphere, encased in ablative shielding that burned with a harsh, white light, impervious to the corrosive spores. They were too numerous and too fast for the vine nets, a meteor shower of armored coffins delivering their deadly cargo. They impacted the forest floor with the force of small earthquakes. The noise, a brutal, percussive drumming that drowned out the planet's quiet rhythm. Hatches blew, and from each pod emerged a squad of Omniterra Marines, clad in sealed, slate-gray combat armor, their helmets faceless and insect-like. They carried plasma carbines and chemical projectors, instruments of sterile, efficient death. This was the true face of the Reclamation Protocol overwhelming force designed to crush, pacify, and sanitize. From his communion with the chorus, Elias experienced the invasion as 1,000 points of stabbing pain. He felt the shockwaves of the impacts through the mycelial network, the crushing of ancient trees, the terror of the smaller forest creatures. He saw through the eyes of a dozen Sylvan scouts as the Marines formed disciplined perimeters, their boots crushing the glowing moss, their weapons spitting superheated plasma that vaporized anything it touched. The initial fight was a chaotic, brutal affair. The forest defenses, so effective against the landers, were less so against this infantry swarm. Marines fell into root pits or were ambushed by Sylvan guardians emerging silently from the shadows. But for every soldier lost, 10 more took their place, their movements coordinated by a central command Elias could feel, but not see a cold, logical presence directing the chaos from above. Aboard the flagship, the OTV Certainty, Commander Valerius watched the battle unfold on a holographic map of the forest. Valerius was a man carved from granite and protocol, his face a landscape of old scars and quiet certainty. He had pacified worlds in a dozen systems, and, to him, this was just another pest control operation. "Report," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Sir, ground teams are meeting heavy resistance," a young ensign reported, his voice tight with tension. "The indigenous lifeforms are aggressive, coordinated. We've sustained 22% casualties in the initial drop." Valerius barely blinked. "Casualties are acceptable. The objective is the establishment of a forward operating base. Have the engineers begin clearing Sector Gamma. I want a defensible perimeter and a functional command post by the next cycle, and deploy the cleanse units." The ensign hesitated. "Sir, cleanse protocol." "Is there an echo on this bridge?" Ensign Valerius turned his gaze from the map to the young man, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "Their primary defense is the flora, so we remove the flora, burn it out, all of it." The command filtered down, and Elias felt it as a wave of pure chemical poison from the backs of specialized marine units. A thick, orange mist began to spray into the forest. It wasn't fire, it was something far worse. It was a defoliant, a tailored bioweapon that attacked life at a cellular level. Where the mist touched, the rust-colored leaves curled and turned black. The glowing fungi shriveled into a gray sludge, and the very soil seemed to groan in agony. Elias experienced this not as a tactical maneuver, but as a personal violation. A psychic scream of unimaginable pain tore through the chorus, a billion dying cells crying out at once. He was thrown from his meditative state, gasping on the forest floor, his own body convulsing in sympathetic agony. The planet was being poisoned, and he felt the venom in his own veins. The Sylvans felt it too. He saw them through the network, recoiling from the spreading orange cloud, their silent grace broken by frantic, pained movements. The defoliant was a weapon they had no defense against. It didn't just kill, it erased the world they knew. In the poison clearing of Sector Gamma, Omni-Terra's efficiency was on full display. Prefabricated barricades were dropped from orbit, snapping into place to form a circular wall. Automated plasma turrets rose from the ground, their sensors sweeping the dying forest. A command spire, the nerve center for the ground operation, was assembled in the center. The FOB, which the Marines had already christened the Blight, was a festering, geometric wound on the living surface of Xylos, a beachhead of gray metal and sterile procedure from which they would launch their war. Valerius himself descended in a command shuttle, his boots touching the packed earth floor of the base without a trace of the world's soil on them. He surveyed the perimeter, the dying trees, the disciplined Marines, and nodded once. It was control. It was order imposed on chaos. Rage, cold and pure, unlike anything he had ever felt, cut through Elias's pain. This was not a war for resources anymore. This was a war of ideology. Valerius and Omni-Terra could not abide a world that did not conform to their logic, a form of life that could not be cataloged, monetized, or controlled. They would rather turn it to ash than allow it to simply be. He realized then that he had been a fool. Teaching the forest to throw rocks and set traps was like teaching a child to fight a machine. They could not win a defensive war against an enemy that was willing to destroy the battlefield itself. The chorus, reeling in agony, instinctively pulled its energy and consciousness away from the poison zones, ceding territory, retreating. But Elias knew that retreat was just a slower form of death. He rose to his feet, his body trembling, and for the first time since his arrival, he imposed his own will upon the chorus. He did not suggest, he commanded. He sent out a singular, focused thought, a spear of pure intent that cut through the waves of pain. Stop retreating. We do not give them another inch. We must cut out the heart of the disease. He felt the chorus hesitate, its collective consciousness still reeling from the chemical assault. The idea of a targeted, offensive strike was alien, a predator's logic, but his own human aggression, the part of him he had tried to suppress for so long, now became their greatest asset. He fused his own memories of military strategy with the planet's intimate knowledge of its own geography. They have a single mind on the ground, he projected, sharing the image of the command spire, the feeling of the cold, logical presence he knew was Valerius. Sever the head, and the body will die. He did not wait for an answer. He began to move, his bare feet carrying him swiftly and silently through the shadowed parts of the forest that were still alive. He was no longer just the echo. He was a weapon, and he was aiming himself at the enemy. As he ran, he felt the Sylvans respond. They rose from their places of shelter, their movements no longer pained or confused, but filled with a new, terrible purpose. The weavers began to create, not defensive nets, but fine, monomolecular filaments of hardened resin, invisible and deadly. The scouts moved to the perimeter of the Blight, not to attack, but to observe, their multifaceted eyes mapping every patrol route, every watchtower, every seam in the armor of the human invasion. The Guardians, their bodies now coated in a final, rock-hard layer of resin, followed Elias, their silent forms slipping through the trees behind him. He was leading a hunting party. He stopped on a ridge overlooking the Omni Terra base, the orange haze of the defoliant stinging his eyes. The sterile lights of the human fortress an insult to the twilight. He felt the pain of the dying world behind him and the cold, hard certainty of his target before him. He had been sent here to determine if this world was viable for exploitation. He had made a mistake in his report. He now understood that Xylos was not just viable, it was vital, and he would personally liquidate any asset that threatened it. The assault on the Blight was an act of silent, surgical fury. It began not with a charge, but with the Earth itself coming undone, directed by the chorus. 1,000 root systems, energized and hardened over cycles of preparation, simultaneously contracted beneath the foundation of the Omni Terra base. The packed earth floor of the compound buckled and split, not with the chaos of an earthquake, but with a terrifying, geometric precision. Fissures opened directly beneath automated turrets, swallowing them whole. Sections of the prefabricated barricades tilted and collapsed as the ground beneath them turned to dust. Marines cried out in shock and confusion, firing their plasma carbines at a foe they couldn't see, an enemy that was the very ground they stood on. From these new chasms, the Sylvan Guardians emerged, not in a swarm, but as apparitions of vengeance. They were covered in the dark soil, their rock-hard limbs moving with a speed that belied their size, and they struck with the force of falling trees. While this subterranean attack threw the base into chaos, Elias began his own infiltration. He moved along the darkened perimeter, a ghost in the twilight, flanked by 2 Sylvan Weavers. They did not tear a hole in the wall, they unmade it. Their delicate fingers danced over a seam in the barricade, secreting a powerful enzyme that dissolved the bonding agents of the alloy. A section of the wall simply fell away, crumbling into a metallic powder with barely a whisper. The chaos inside was his cover. Marines were shouting, firing wildly into the ground, their strict fire discipline shattered by an enemy that defied all tactical doctrine. No one noticed the lone human figure slipping through the newly created gap, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the command spire at the center of the storm. He met resistance almost immediately, a squad of Marines, trying to form a defensive line, spotted him. "Hostile contact. It's a man. It's Vance," one of them yelled, his voice a tinny squawk through his helmet's external speaker. They raised their carbines, but the Sylvan Guardians, who had been shadowing Elias from the newly opened fissures, rose up behind them. The fight was over before the first Marine could pull the trigger. There was no sound of plasma fire, only the sickening crunch of armor and bone as the Guardians neutralized the threat with brutal efficiency. Elias didn't pause. He kept moving, the silent, deadly Guardians clearing a path for him toward the spire. The spire itself was a fortress within a fortress, its entrance guarded by 2 heavy plasma cannons and a squad of elite Praetorian guards in polished black armor. Here, a direct assault was suicide, but Elias had not come to fight a battle of attrition. He stopped in the shadow of a collapsed barracks, placed his hands on the living soil, and projected his intent to the chorus. The entrance blocked their line of sight. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The ground before the spire entrance erupted, not with Guardians, but with life. A massive, thorny vine, thick as a python and moving with unnatural speed, burst from the earth, coiling into a dense, impenetrable wall of vegetation that completely obscured the entrance. The Praetorians, startled, unleashed a torrent of plasma into the writhing mass. But the vine was too thick, its living tissue absorbing the heat and sealing its own wounds with thick, resinous sap. It was the distraction he needed. He circled around the back of the spire, where a weaver was already waiting for him. It had unmade a small, man-sized portion of the wall, creating a dark, silent entrance. He nodded once to the creature and slipped inside. The interior of the spire was a place of cold, sterile order. Blue holographic displays flickered, and the air hummed with the sound of machinery and filtered air. At the center of the command deck stood Valerius, his back to the entrance, staring at the holographic map that now showed his forces in a state of chaotic retreat. Containment failure on all fronts, he muttered to himself, his voice laced with cold fury. How can primitives? They aren't primitives, Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire forest. Valerius spun around, his hand instantly going to the plasma pistol at his hip. He was fast, but Elias was faster. He lunged forward, not attacking, but closing the distance, his hand gripping Valerius's wrist before the pistol could be drawn. Vance. Valerius snarled, his face a mask of contempt. The traitor, you've contaminated yourself. You've let this world's disease into your mind. You're the disease, Elias countered, his grip like iron. You see a living world, and your only instinct is to pave it, to sterilize it, to force it onto a balance sheet. It's called order. Valerius shoved Elias back, breaking his grip and finally drawing his pistol. It's the logic that lifted humanity from the mud, something you've forgotten, wallowing in it. He aimed the pistol at Elias's chest. Protocol dictates I take you alive for interrogation. I'm waiving that protocol. As Valerius's finger tightened on the trigger, Elias did the last thing the commander expected. He didn't attack. He didn't run. He closed his eyes, reached out, and opened the floodgates of his mind. He became a pure conduit for the mycelian chorus. He took all the pain of the dying forest, all the terror of the hunted sylvans, all the agony of the defoliant, and he pushed it into the mind of the man before him. Valerius screamed. It was not a sound of pain, but of psychic disintegration. His mind, so ordered and rigid, was suddenly flooded with the experiences of a billion living things. He felt his own bioweapon eating away at his skin. He felt the crushing weight of a collapsing tree. He felt the collective grief of a world under siege. He saw through 1,000 multifaceted eyes at once, experienced a consciousness so vast and interconnected that his own sense of self, the ego of Commander Valerius, was instantly annihilated. It was like pouring an ocean into a teacup. The pistol dropped from his nerveless fingers. His eyes, wide and vacant, stared at nothing. A single tear of blood traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He collapsed, his mind shattered, his body a living shell with no one inside. The death of Valerius's consciousness was a psychic shockwave that reverberated through the Omniterra command network. On the ground, the Marines' heads-up displays went dark. Their tactical overlays vanished, and the calm, authoritative voice guiding them was replaced by static, leaderless, surrounded, and fighting an enemy that was the world itself. Their disciplined formations broke completely. It became a rout. The reclaimer cruisers in orbit, receiving no signal from their commander and seeing the complete collapse of the ground operation, followed their own protocols. An asset survivor was not worth the loss of 3 capital ships. With a cold, silent efficiency, they turned and vanished back into the void. The war was over. Elias stood on the ridge overlooking the silent, corpse-strewn ruin of the Blight, the orange scars of the defoliant, a testament to the battle's cost. The forest had won. But it was a wounded, changed place. The mycelian chorus no longer sang a song of pure life. Its harmony was now laced with a somber, steely theme of survival and memory. It would heal, but it would never be innocent again. The Sylvans gathered around him, their silent presence a mixture of gratitude and a new, shared sorrow. He was one of them, their echo, their protector. But he was also a permanent reminder of the violence that had come from the stars. He looked up at the sky, at the place where the cruisers had been, and felt not triumph, but a profound and heavy sense of purpose. He was the guardian of this world now, its sentinel. He had fled a soulless corporation only to find his soul by binding it to the fate of a world. The peace that settled over Xylos was not the gentle peace of before, but a warrior's peace, earned in blood and poison, and in the heart of the recovering forest. Elias Vance stood watch, a lone human sentinel, forever a part of the world that had remade him, listening to the slow, deep, and now vigilant song of the planet.